Thank you for joining us for our tutorial for question number 8 of our daily review. This question is talking about rates, and it's going to show us rates in tables. Like we often do, we'll start with a description of what we are talking about for this particular problem. So when we describe rates, we are describing a comparison of two different items. We are always talking about things or items when we talk about rates, and we'll see an example of this in just a moment. Rates often use words like per or maybe words like for every. And these aren't the only words that describe rates. You might see things that say each or every. But these are probably the most common things that we'll see, and per is especially the most common. Rates are also written as fractions or written in tables. And the table is actually just a bunch of different rates written as fractions put together. And it's kind of a simpler way to write multiple sets of those rates out. And we'll see how that looks in just a few minutes when we start to build our first table. Let's go ahead and take a look at an example of a word problem for rates, and we'll see how we can turn that word problem for rates into a table and help us find some values for this particular situation. So in this case, we have Robert earns a wage of $15.75 per hour. First, we're going to notice that we see that common word per, and that's a clue that we're working with rates. Second, we are going to start to think about what are the two items or the two things that are being described in this particular problem. And so real quickly, I'm going to identify that we are talking about dollars and we are talking about hours. Those are the two things in this problem. Now, there are numbers attached to both of those things. We are talking about $15.75. That's the dollars. And in this case, it's per 1 hour. It doesn't say that word one, but per hour means per 1 hour. And so we have the number 1 attached to that. Now, if we're just going to describe these as a rate, we said that we want to write them as fractions, or they can also be written in tables. So here's an example written as a fraction. We would just show dollars over hours. We could also write it as hours over dollars, although I will say that the first example is going to be the most common. Both of these are correct. However, in general, when you see the word per, whatever is with that word per is going to go on the bottom. And just a couple of other quick examples of rates that you might be familiar with. The most common one is, think about driving down the street and you might see a sign that says 35 mph, and that stands for miles per hour. Again, we have two things there, miles and hours. Or maybe you're walking through the grocery store and you see some Jelly Bellies, and it tells you that those cost $3.78 per pound. Again, we're talking about dollars and we're talking about pounds. We're comparing two different things in that example. But we're going to go ahead and stick with this example of working with Robert's wage. So let's go ahead and start to build this out on a table. So I have Robert's wage. We've already described, let's build our table here, and we've described the two things that we are working with, and that is dollars and hours. So again, the most common way to do this is whatever is with the per is going to go on the bottom, so I'll put the hour on the bottom there. Now, there are a lot of different ways that we can see these tables. Sometimes we're given information. Sometimes we have to find missing information. There's a lot of different things. So I'm going to try to go through many different possibilities here in just one table. So let's go ahead and start by building out our table. $15.75 goes on the top, and 1 hour goes on the bottom. Now, if you just focus in there for a minute, you're going to notice that that itself looks like a fraction. Remember, in our last section, we just said that these are written as fractions or as tables. So you can think about each one of those little boxes in this table as being its own fraction. Let's go ahead and use some knowledge that we have to build out this table a little bit from here. Let's say that we want to figure out how much money Robert would earn in 2 hours. Well, we could simply fill the 2 in the bottom, and we have several different strategies to figure out how much money he would have earned. In this case, it's probably easiest to simply just add $15.75 with $15.75 because we are doing that over the course of 2 hours. And if we do that, we end up with $31.50. Again, you can imagine each one of those being its own fraction for this particular problem. Now, that's some information, but sometimes we might have a table that looks something like this, where we have some given information and some missing information. And we're going to look at some strategies that we could find what is missing in this particular table. So we had hour 1, we had hour 2, but you're going to notice that we skipped. We didn't go straight to hour 3, we went up to hour 5. There are several different ways that you can find out how much money Robert would earn in 5 hours. We'll talk about multiple ways here together. The first thing that we might want to do is we might want to just start listing out those hours that we're missing. So I can go hour 1, hour 2, hour 3, hour 4, and hour 5, and I'll eventually land on what that is. In order to do that, just like what we did in our first section, we can just start adding $15.75 to each of the previous values. And once I've done that 5 times, I'm going to end up with $78.75. I also might have a different strategy. I can notice that hour 5, within that, I could work from hour 2, and I could multiply that by 2. And if I multiply that by 2, that's going to tell me 4 hours of work. And you're going to notice how those values are the same. I ended up with $63. When I did 2 hours 2 times, that should give me the same amount as doing 4 hours, which you're going to notice there, it says $63. Then I can add 1 hour of work, $15.75, and I can end up with the total for 5 hours. And you're going to notice that those two values are the same. I ended up with $78.75, both methods. I also could have done something else, and we could do this because we actually have something really special here. This is what's called a unit rate. And unit rates are really helpful because they can help us solve some tricky problems. And unit rates are any time we end up per one of something. So I only have one unit rate in this table, and that unit rate is the first column because it's per 1 hour. Unit rates are always per one of something. Now I can use that unit rate to help me find more complex hours like 5, and I can simply do that by taking 1 hour's worth of work and multiplying that by 5, because that should get me 5 hours of work. And so that was $15.75 times 5. And you're going to notice that all 3 ways we ended up with the same value of $78.75. Now, when you solve these problems, you don't need to do them all 3 ways. I'm simply showing multiple opportunities and multiple ways that you could work on these types of problems. Let's use the same strategy to see if we can figure out how much money Robert would have earned after 7 hours. Well, we've got multiple choices here. One choice is I could have taken 3 hours and I could multiply that by 2. I had that in my work below, and I 3 hours times 2 would be 6 hours. And then I could add $15.75 to that. That's one option. I could have also continued building my table out. I could have done hour 6 and hour 7. I also might have, and here's a new method, I also could have chosen to take 5 hours worth of work and 2 hours worth of work, and I could have added those together. We knew that the value of 2 hours worth of work was $31.50, and I could just add that to the 5 hours of work, because 5 plus 2 equals 7 hours. 5 hours plus 2 hours equals 7 hours. That means the value that Robert would have earned, I just have to add those up, and that should also equal what Robert earned in those 7 hours. And finally, we can use that unit rate again, and I could take 1 hour's worth of work, and I can multiply that by 7 hours, and all three methods, I'm going to end up with the same value of $110.25. Now, for those of you that have already started to look ahead to the next problem, you're going to notice something that's a little bit tricky here. If I start to build out hour 7, hour 8, and hour 9, you're going to notice that our value of $130 doesn't quite match up here. It fits somewhere in between 8 hours and 9 hours. And sometimes when we work with rates, this happens. We don't end up with things that work out perfectly. And so in order to do this, we need to use a different strategy, a strategy we haven't yet talked about. In this case, I know that the amount of hours that Robert will work will be somewhere between hour 8 and hour 9, but we don't know exactly where that is. Well, in order to find that, I can simply do some division or work backwards in this problem. If I know that Robert has earned $130, I can divide that by Robert's hourly rate of $15.75, and that will give me information about how many hours that it would take to earn that. In this case, it would take 8.25396825 hours, and that did fall between 8 hours and 9 hours like we predicted. And in this particular instance, we would want to round that to 8.25 or 8 1/4 hours, or 8 hours and 15 minutes worth of work. This gives you an example of how to work with rates in many different forms. Please make sure that you go back and check in with any of the different methods if you're feeling stuck on any of the individual parts of question 8 for our daily review.